Hello, today we're going to look at Cold War around the world. So here's how this is going to work. You have your notes to fill in. I'm going to read you kind of the story and the background of what's happening in each of these nations. And then I would guess, take a second and guess, like, what would you do if you were a leader in charge in this situation? How would you respond? And then we'll go through how the United States responded. And so we're going to see that the United States has a bunch of very difficult decisions to make around the world because of this fear of communism spreading. So the perceived threat was something called the Domino Theory. And the idea was that the Soviet Union was continuing to expand around the world into different countries. We saw it in China, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. These countries had become communist. And so the worry was that was going to turn other countries communist as well, and the world would continue to become that way. And because capitalism and communism are polar opposites, we clearly do not want that as a nation. And so the United States starts using all kinds of different weapons, whether it be economic or military, to try to stop communism. And they do this in different countries. So the solution was containment. How do we push back and stop communism from spreading? So here we go. We're going to look at some countries. Our first country is Guatemala, located in Central America. During the 1930s and 40s, there was a dictator that was leading the government there, and he was really friendly to U.S. and foreign investments. So American companies such as the United Fruit Company were able to buy land and create plantations for bananas and other fruits, things like that. And the plantations took up a large amount of land in Guatemala. And so a lot of people in Guatemala, the Guatemalans, they didn't like this. They were frustrated that so much of their land was being taken up from these American corporations. So in 1950, we see a big change. Jacobo Arbenz Guzman is elected as the president. He actually gets 65% of the popular vote. No American president ever gets 65% of the popular vote. And he becomes president. It's a really big deal in the United States because some of his ideas fit with socialism, the idea of using everybody's wealth to help, or using some people's wealth to help everybody. So he pushes for land reform. What he's finding is that about 5% of the population, a large portion of the land was owned by 5% of the population. And so he's saying he wants to fix the unequal land distribution. And so he wants to redistribute some of this land that these big plantations have and give it to Guatemalan farmers so that more people can have land. Well, obviously, the United Fruit Company from the United States did not like this idea. The Americans view this as the first steps to communism as well. And they're very worried that private property is being taken by the government. So in 1953 and 4, the Guatemalan government takes over large segments of land that's not being used yet by the United Fruit Company and pays them what they feel it is worth. Leadership for the United Fruit Company is furious, and they demand that the United States gets involved and tries to stop this leader in Guatemala. So if you're the United States, what do you do here? You probably don't want to get involved in another country, but at the same time, there's some tendencies that could lead to communism, which you're fearful of. You have a U.S. company that's not doing very well because of this. What do you do? So I'm going to ask my kids in class to think the same thing. You take a second if you want. Well, here's what the U.S. actually does. They cut off trade and economic aid. They stop helping Guatemala in any way. They make a propaganda campaign against Guzman. So our government makes this campaign with basically lies, saying all these bad things about Guzman to try to get people to go against him. We train an army that invades Guatemala. This is true. So the Central Intelligence Agency trains an army. They invade Guatemala. Guzman is forced to resign, and a new leader comes into power who is favored by the United States. And when this becomes public, the international press is really against it. They don't like anything that's happening here. The U.S. claims it's fighting communism, but in reality, this does not make us look very good. But again, there's this fear that it's going to become a communist nation. And so even though Guzman is democratically elected, because he has tendencies that favor communism potentially, we don't even know if that's going to happen, some people are not all right with him being around, including the United States. So that is situation number one. Situation number 2. In 1957, the Soviet Union launches the first satellite into orbit. It's named Sputnik, which means traveler. There are no passengers, and there is great fear in America. They don't know what this thing can do. They don't know if it can shoot down to Earth, what it can do at all. Realistically, it's just kind of a big old piece of metal compared to our modern day satellites, but we don't know what's going to happen with it. So how does the United States respond? Well, here's what we see happens. We put huge amounts of money into our own space program because we don't want to be left behind. We don't want the Soviet Union to have dominance in space. And nobody really knows what you can do in space at this time. Within 4 months, we launch our own satellite. And this begins the space race. And the United States, in the end, is seen as the victor when in 1969, we land on the moon. And so we had this race to get to the moon. Who could get there first? And in the end, did space matter in terms of, a democratic or communist victory? No, it didn't. But it was a competition of wills and a competition of showing, communism and Soviet Union is better, or democracy and capitalism is better here in the United States. So we saw a lot of back and forth. 1958, we launch our first satellite. We also create the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, known as NASA. In 1959, Luna is launched, and the Soviet Union hits the moon with this probe, which we had not done yet. Same year, we have Laika, the first dog in space. So the Soviet Union puts an actual living being in space, a creature. 1961, they beat us into space. The Russians send Yuri Gagarin into space. He's the first person to orbit the Earth. He does come down alive as well. Well, we are right after him now. We're catching up, and we send Alan Shepard Jr., and he orbits the Earth as well. 1962, we send John Glenn Jr. In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova is the first woman in space, so that's pretty cool. 1968, the mission from the United States that was the first manned space mission to orbit the moon. So for the first time, we orbit the moon. And then in 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins land on the moon, with Armstrong being the first to walk on the moon. And we continue to go back to the moon after that, but that's seen as the victory. We were able to get to the moon first. And this was a huge event for America. It proved that we could use our knowledge and abilities to achieve amazing things. And this is also the beginning of science and math becoming huge in schools. A lot of money was put towards those subjects to make them better because everyone was worried that we were falling behind the communists in Russia. And if they could do these things to beat us in space, well, maybe they could beat us in the battlefield too. And we certainly did not want that. So that is our second one. Our third situation is very sad, and it's in Hungary. The year is 1956. And citizens in Hungary's a satellite nation, which means that even though it's its own country, it's forced to follow what the Soviet Union and Russia wants. So in 1956, citizens in Hungary revolt, and they overthrow the communist government that's going along with the Soviet Union. Their leader, Emir Nagy, rejects the Warsaw Pact, which brought all Soviet countries together. He asks the United Nations to help establish neutrality. They're really worried that the Russians are just going to come in and crush them. Now, the Hungarians have been listening to the radio, and on the radio, there's a program called Radio Free Europe. It was run by the CIA in the United States, and the program encouraged communist countries to fight for their free government. Because of this and statements like the Truman Doctrine, many in Hungary really felt the United States would support their cause. And so Hungary is free for a moment, but it looks like in a matter of time, the Soviet army is probably going to come back in and try to take over. So the United States has a window. Do they try to help out in Hungary or not? Now, one note is if you try to help out in Hungary, Russia's right here, and you could get into a war with Russia, which you don't want. But if you don't help out in Hungary, Russia's probably going to take over the country again. So what will the United States do? Well, we don't get involved. We're fearful of going to war with the Soviet Union. And so 12 days later, the Soviet Union enters Hungary with tanks. The Hungarians fight boldly, but they have nothing. Like, they're using Molotov cocktails, they're using guns, and the Russians have massive tanks. The fighting lasts under a week. A new government is put in place. 30,000 Hungarians are killed. 200,000 flee to the west. And Eisenhower did nothing. This idea of the Truman Doctrine of enforcing, democracy was trumped by the fear that we would get in a fight with the Soviet Union. And so this is a pretty sad situation for the Hungarians. That we just did not want to get into war with the Soviet Union. So, all right, our last ones, Cuba and Fidel Castro. So what we have in Cuba is in 1961, a revolution occurs and Fidel Castro becomes a leader there. He is openly communist and he is openly friends with the Soviet Union. This worries Americans a lot because we are right next to Cuba. We're very close to Cuba. And so the United States decides they're going to try to stop this. And we have what's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. And what happens here is we have some Cubans who are willing to work with us, and we secretly train them. And our goal is to take over Cuba, to force Fidel Castro out of power. Well, the secret gets out of the bag as they go onto the beaches. They're surrounded by Cuban soldiers, and it's no good. They get wiped out. So it's an absolute failure. It's an embarrassment for the United States government. Our new president, Kennedy, is embarrassed by it as well. And so it's just bad all around. So Eisenhower is the one that allows it to go forth. Kennedy's the president. He approves it. The Cubans meet 25,000 Cuban soldiers with Soviet tanks. Some are killed, others are imprisoned. And the American government's embarrassed and basically pay $53 million in food and medicine to Cuba so that these people who tried to invade are released instead of being imprisoned. So that was not a win for the United States. But then things escalate. On the 14th of October, 1962, we have photos that show that there are nuclear missile sites within Cuba. Some of the missiles ready to launch. The missiles are close enough that they could hit U.S. cities. And so we literally have missiles in a communist country within 20 minutes of the United States. So we have to decide what to do. Well, Kennedy puts the United States on alert. He declares that he has plans to remove the missiles. At the same time, in these waters to Cuba, there are ships approaching, and Americans believe that they are carrying nuclear weapons to Cuba to be launched on rockets into the United States. The Navy's prepared. It's got 100,000 troops ready and waiting in Florida. Our Navy's ready out here. So the question is, what do you do with these ships that it may have nuclear weapons? What do you do with Cuba? So decide, if you're the president, what do you do? Well, here's what happens. Soviet ships stop. They don't want to have conflict with the United States, and so they stop. Days later, the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, agrees to remove the missiles in Cuba, and the United States pledges that they will not invade Cuba. And we remove missiles in Turkey, which are pretty close to Russia. So both sides move some missiles to provide a little bit more protection for their country. And we agree that we won't invade Cuba. We're going to allow Cuba to remain a communist country, and it has continued to do so. So that's what we see from that situation. But we were very close, a lot of people feel, to having an actual nuclear war if Fidel Castro had decided to launch a nuclear missile. Last part is the Berlin Wall. And here's what we have in this case. In 1961, one goal that had guided Kennedy through the Cuban Missile Crisis was that to prove that Khrushchev, he had determination to stop and contain communism. However, what we had happening was the construction of the Berlin Wall. What you had was there were two parts to Berlin. Half of it was communist. This is the capital of Germany. And half of it was capitalist. So US, France, and Britain had this side, and the other side was controlled by communist Russia. And so Russia starts to build a wall between the two sides. In 1961, Berlin was a city in great turmoil. In the 11 years since the Berlin airlift, almost 3 million East Germans, 20% of the country's population, had fled into West Berlin because it was free from communist rule. These refugees advertised the failure of East Germany's communist government. This departure was also dangerously weakening the country's economy. So you have a lot of the communists in the East are trying to escape to the West for a better life. And this is stripping East Berlin of good workers, very bright people, money, different things like that. So what happens? Khrushchev realized that this is a problem that had to be solved. At a summit meeting in Vienna in 1961, he threatens to sign a treaty with East Germany that would enable that country to close all access to West Berlin. Kennedy refuses to give up access to West Berlin, so Khrushchev furiously declares, "I want peace, but if you want war, that is your problem." After returning home, Kennedy told the nation in a televised address that Berlin was the greatest testing place of Western courage and will. He says, "We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin." So, we don't have a fight there, but what the communists do is they surprise the world and they decide to begin creating an actual physical concrete barrier wall. And so the city of Berlin is now separated. And Berlin was in the heart of East Germany, surrounded by communism. So if this part here, West Berlin, that's French, American, and British, is taken over, like there's no help to be had. So they create this massive wall and they create kind of this dead zone in between. And those in East Berlin, if you're trying to escape, you get shot. And so this prevents East Berliners from coming through for the most part. Some of them still do come through in various ways through tricky maneuvers, but it really shows that the communist government was trying to keep people in, whereas the Western government had no problem keeping people in because conditions were better there. So the wall stays up until the late 80s, the early 90s when it comes down. And, we also see communism fails as well. In the end, does the United States win against the communist Soviet Union? We do. We never go to actual war with them, but the communist Soviet Union begins to collapse in the late 80s and fully collapses in 1991 and has become a variety of different countries now today. And so while we still have communism in the world, it's smaller scale, it's smaller countries that traditionally have it, with the exception of China, which is a little different. And all of this fear over communism taking over the world never happened, thankfully. And we see that capitalism and democracy are the main forms of government and business to this day. So that's what we got. You can use this information to answer your questions on the worksheet that goes with this. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks. Bye.